Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs. Conjugated verbs are fly. Infinitives are not. Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs.
Conjugated verbs are fly. Infinitives are not.
Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs.
Conjugate those verbs. Let's start with AR. Don't get them confused with some irregulars. A star just won't cut it. The endings are not cool. Just forget about them till you get to high school.
Let's start the conjugation. The first form is yo. Just take off the AR and add a nice big O. If you got that down, let's move on to 2. Take off the AR and add an AS, foo.
When you're talking about someone, like who said ARL, replace the AR with an A. Dang, what's that smell? The next one is nosotros. The ending will be almost. If that smell don't go away, nosotros vomitamos.
Ellos ustedes. It all means they. Just take off the AR and add un. My Spanish teacher loves it. My grades are really high. They ask me how I do it, and simply I reply. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs. Conjugated verbs are fly. Infinitives are not. Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs.
Conjugated verbs are fly. Infinitives are not.
Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs.
Conjugate those verbs. Catch me on the block. Conjugating ER verbs, that's just why I'm hot. The yo form is the same as any other verb. Don't you think that's easy? I think it's pretty word.
You got to use that too when you're talking about you. The ending is ES. Check out these new gangster shoes. For AIL usted, the ending is just E. Nosotros is amos when you're talking about we.
Next is ustedes, ellos and ellos. The ending is EN. Now we done with that, bros. I'm rolling in my ride. I'm out to hit the clubs while I'm conjugating verbs, cause it's what Miss Larson loves.
If you think we're done, then you're just straight up wrong. There's a whole new kind of verb. Let's continue with the song. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs. Conjugated verbs are fly. Infinitives are not. Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs.
Conjugated verbs are fly. Infinitives are not.
Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs.
Conjugate those verbs. It's time for IR verbs. They're really quite easy. Shawty, they're superb. The endings are the same as the ER forms. To conjugate the verbs, well, that's why I was born.
The nosotros form is different. Amos will not do. Replace it with an emos, and that is pretty. If you have a problem, you can holla on my cell. Where do I live? Vivo NLATL.
When I hit the club, verbs are what I deal. Only conjugated ones, irregulars don't appeal. My ride is super fly. I'm rolling in the dough. My crib is really sexy, and so is my afro.
I change almost as many endings as I have girlfriends. Conjugations give me money, and on rims is how I spend. I'm rolling in the streets, my homies by my side. People say I'm lame, but I'm reppin' Morningside. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate those verbs. Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs. Conjugated verbs are fly. Infinitives are not. Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs.
Conjugated verbs are fly. Infinitives are not.
Conjugate, conjugate, conjugate those verbs.